Good morning, Internet. My name is Mike, but I write historical fiction under the name of Eli Kale. This is the 6th video on my writing process, and today we're going to talk about revising your second draft, doing a second read-through of your manuscript. So let's get started. In the last video we talked about returning to your manuscript after taking a break, a few days, a few weeks, whatever your preference is, and revising your first draft all the way through for the first time from start to finish. Now, for the second one, you can take a couple of days off. You can take a small break, but then come back to your manuscript not too long after you finished your first read-through. That first read-through was to get the basic flow and the gist of your story and to catch any minor errors. I believe that this second read-through is the time that you need to really put the most attention into your manuscript. Just figure out if there needs to be any changes made, any major changes that affect the storyline, and this would be the time to make those changes and to amend your manuscript accordingly. Because you have the flow of your story down, you should be able to more efficiently make any appropriate amendments to your story and then be able to move on in the revision process. Things that I like to focus on in the second read-through of my manuscripts are things related to plot, what's keeping the story moving forward. Is it moving forward? Is it stalling anywhere? Other things like character development, backstory, things that the reader might think about while reading. Where does this character come from? Why is he or she acting in such a way? And then also things like dialogue. Dialogue is a very important tool at the author's disposal. It can be used to move the plot along and also to reveal story and or character information to the reader. A good way to approach writing dialogue is to think of it as fuel for a car. If your dialogue is not moving the plot along, the plot being the car in this metaphor, or not revealing any pertinent information about the story or a character, or giving any emotion or building up tension in the story, then you need to revise that dialogue and make it work a little bit better. There's no real formula for how to do that, simply because it's the nature of writing. Everyone's story is different, so there's not any real one way to say how to make your dialogue happen like I just said. There is a way, however, to do it correctly in terms of structuring your sentence, which I'll show you here. Here you can see an excerpt from my first book, Resistant, which follows Rienne, a young French girl living in Paris, as she has to deal with the German invasion in 1940 and the things that kind of happened that pushed the story along after that. Before I get into the different highlights here that you see, first I'll explain two things. One, there is a thing called a dialogue tag, and a second one, a dialogue beat. A dialogue tag is basically the verb that you use with the dialogue, meaning instead of saying she said or he said all the time, you would throw something else in there. So in this case, you can see the first one, she exclaimed. That's a dialogue tag. A dialogue beat is something that kind of maybe describes this part in the dialogue, or just something that happens between words that are spoken by the characters. So in the green you can see wrapping me up in a loving hug. That's a dialogue beat because in this case it's happening at the same time as the dialogue tag. There's no real rule on stating whether or not you have to have a beat with a tag every time you use a tag, but it helps just because it can break up the dialogue, and also it tells you what the characters are doing, because if you just have a long paragraph or a couple of paragraphs of dialogue of characters exchanging words, you don't know what they're doing in the meantime. So it helps to give the reader kind of a picture in their mind so they can see what's going on in their head, but also they can understand what's happening in the story at the same time. Now, in terms of structuring your sentence, like I mentioned before, most writers should know how to do this by now if you are writing a story and are publishing it. But if not, I will explain anyway. So whenever you have dialogue, you always indent a ½ an inch in the paragraph, and then you have your quote, and then whatever the words are, and then after that, when you end your quote, you always have the punctuation before the end quote. You never have it be the quote and then the exclamation point or the comma or the period. You always have it before. And then say that it's like in this example, Rienne, she exclaimed, wrapping me up in a loving hug. The exclamation point is there because it goes along with the tag, exclaimed. You wouldn't put a comma there or a period, because that doesn't really make it as exciting as I mean it to be and as I'm writing it. So I use an exclamation point. Now, in regular sentences, you would think exclamation point ends a sentence, so the next word should be capitalized, right? Not all the time when it comes to dialogue. In this case, Rienne, she exclaimed, the lowercase s in she is correct, because that's just the way it works. There's no real other way to say it. She exclaimed, comma, wrapping me up in a loving hug. Wrapping me up in a loving hug is just a clause. Again, it's the beat that goes along with the tag. And then if you look a little farther down to that third blue highlight, you see she says, hello, comma, father, comma, end quote. I acknowledged happily. So that's Rien speaking. So again, you indent the half an inch, and you have the start quote, the beginning quote, hello, and then the first comma is, that's my preference. It's not a real big deal if you use it either way or if you don't. But again, you have that second comma after father before the end quote. And then I acknowledged happily. Acknowledged happily is a tag. In this case, it's 2 words. The tag doesn't necessarily have to be 1 word, but that's how I did it right there. Another rule with dialogue is that whenever you have a new person, a new character talk, that begins a new paragraph. So you wouldn't have the hello father, which is spoken by Rien, you wouldn't have that tagged onto the end of the sentence before. It says also smiling, joining in on the hug. You wouldn't have it right there, a space after, because it's a new person speaking a new paragraph. So there's a little crash course on how to structure your dialogue and how to do it correctly and properly. To come back on tags for a minute, it's really preference in terms of what you use for tags. I tend not to use said, he said, she said a lot, just because that gets boring after a while. So I tell people not to use that all the time, but at the same time you don't want to not use it. So my rule of thumb is that I only use said when it's an important part of the story where I don't want the reader's flow to be broken up. If something important is happening, I want them to keep reading so that way they can get the information and process it well. I then use fancy tags to help convey emotion or help me play into a dialogue beat coming after the dialogue. And by fancy, I just mean something other than said. It can be anything like interjected or added softly. Those are just 2 examples that I had written down. But it's something other than said. If you go back and forth using the different types of tags, fancy or non-fancy, that can keep your writing fresh and refined, and it'll keep the reader moving through the story and not wondering why is the writer only using said so many times, or why are they trying to be fancy using all these other tags. So things like that to kind of consider when writing dialogue. I'd like to end today's vlog by promoting a fellow writer of historical books, Evelyn Tidman. She lives in England and she writes stories about real history and real people. Her interests are widespread, and that's pretty evident in the stories that she has written. 3 of her works include Gentlemen of Fortune. It's a story about 18th century Welsh pirate Black Bart. Her second one is called One Small Candle. It's a story about the Pilgrim Fathers. And the third book, which actually she wrote first, but it sat on the shelf for 20 years until it was properly tended to, is called For the King, and it's about the English Civil War. So I'll include the links to her website and her sales pages in the description, so if you want to give her a look and see what you think, that'd be awesome. Well, that's it for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you are not subscribed to my channel yet, hit that subscribe button. And please check out my website, elikaleauthor.com. You can find all of my books and different projects that I'm working on there. And I'll see you next week. Thanks.